Great. Thank you so much, Rebecca. Really want to thank both my colleagues, Eric and Rebecca, for such a terrific set of presentations that really allows us to think, I think, in really deep and contextualized way about both how the image of the immigrant has long been contested and has long been contested in similar kinds of ways, and yet each cycle of immigration produces yet new forms and new modes of nativism. It also produces new modes of exclusion, and that's part of the story as we move from the late 19th into the 20th century, is that the role of the national state becomes more and more central to the regulation of immigration, and also the state becomes, in a way, which I'll talk about in a second, becomes a powerful vehicle for people's ideas about who ought to be an American and who ought not to be an American. In a way that in the 18th century, in Eric's period, very few people would have thought of turning to some national body to determine this question. Increasingly, in the late 19th and 20th century, it's precisely to the national state that people turn to adjudicate these questions. So one way we might then begin to think about that question is to look at a graph that shows immigration in the 20th century, and then obviously shows a kind of a cycle on one end in the 1920s, and really that's a continuation of the cycle of immigration that Rebecca began talking about from really the post-Reconstruction period through the early 1920s, and then a very significant dip. I'm sure this is relatively familiar to all of you, and then a kind of renewed cycle with very different groups of immigrants dominating after the 1970s. And it's really this middle period of the age of immigration restriction that's so fascinating in the middle of the 20th century. But let me return to the earlier period first, the 1870s through the early 1920s, and move to this slide. So we might think about that period as an era in which ideas of restriction began to be formalized and began to adhere in particular groups, and ideas about who ought to be excluded became what were articulated in public forums and eventually in legislation. This was immigration dominated by Europe, increasingly, as Rebecca mentioned, with a diversity of both Southern, Eastern, and Northern Europeans, a surge from Mexico with smaller but absolutely critical East Asian immigration, particularly from China and Japan, that were highly racialized, as Rebecca showed. And of course, the context for this is very important. This is the real takeoff period for the Second American Industrial Revolution, the mechanized Industrial Revolution and the massive urbanization that accompanied that industrialization and the enormous demand for industrial labor that's accompanying that. The nativist cycles in this period, again, as Rebecca alluded to, were dominated increasingly by racial science and eugenics, by ideas about superior and inferior races, as the example of the anti-Chinese movement demonstrated. But continuing from earlier periods, we see a focus on language, we see a focus on religion, particularly Jews and Catholics, and also an interesting focus on radicalism. Beginning in the 1880s and extending through the Red Scare after World War I, there's a great fear, or there's the capacity to stir fear, that immigrants are bringing foreign radical ideologies into the United States, from Italian anarchism to German socialism. This restrictionist era really led to the 1924 National Origins Act, which I'm sure many of you know quite well, and I'm sure teach in your courses. What's notable, I'm actually going to skip to the next slide. You know, what I'm going to do is go back to this slide. What's notable about the National Origins Act, of course, is that it restricts immigration with a formula that is highly biased toward Northern European immigration and highly biased against Southern and Eastern Europe and Asian immigration. It effectively says we want to turn off the spigot of immigration from Catholic and Jewish regions and Orthodox regions of Europe and leave the spigot relatively open from Protestant Northern European regions. We want to exclude entirely from Asia, and Mexico is largely at this point left alone, in large part because of the increasing demand for agricultural labor and the important influence of Southern legislators, Southwestern and Southern legislators and agribusiness increasingly in the 1920s who were interested in Mexican labor. And that really then creates a 50-year, roughly 50-year period, half-century period, during which there's enormous reduction in immigration from Europe. And when that period comes to a close with the 1965 Hart-Celler Act, which reverses the quotas, you see a renewed surge in immigration with a very distinct change in its character. You can see the the blue Eastern and Southern European lines grow slightly after the 1970s, but not very much, particularly in relationship to Latin America, Caribbean, and Asia. And so this new cycle in the more recent period is, I think, represents a very distinct moment in that longer history. Let me talk a little bit now in the time I have remaining about how students might compare, and that's what this slide is about. It's really about thinking through how your students can compare across these three distinct moments. The restrictionist era, in which ideas about immigration restriction began to take hold before their and the period when the idea of using the national state as the kind of arbiter of Americanness, and who gets to enter the United States and who doesn't take hold, really culminating in the 1924 Act and one in 1921 as well. Then the middle decades of the 20th century, during which that restrictionist regime was in place, and then the post-1965 era. And across these three registers, the nature of immigration in the top, that is to say, what areas of the world were dominant in sending or people coming from those countries to the United States. The second row, what was the basic economic context of the country during that cycle of immigration. And then finally, in the row at the bottom, what were the cornerstones? What were the operative categories and themes of the nativism of those periods? And I think this is especially important. It's relatively easy through showing the kinds of charts that we've shown in this presentation to have students see how immigration changes over time. Right, and this period might be dominated by one group, and another period, another national or continental group might dominate. It's relatively easy, I think, for students to see those shifts over time. I think it's less obvious to them how nativism changes or how nativism evolves, because it seems as if it's just a kind of unchanging conflict about newcomers. But I think there are ways that we can unpack and dig deeper and help students understand that there are certainly consistent themes across these, really across the whole of immigration, going back to the 17th century, as Eric showed. But the changes are just as important. So, right, if Eric says in the 18th century, there's a sense that Northern Europeans cannot get along, and the Quakers are abusing the Germans and the Irish and so on. Right. By the 20th century, as Rebecca says, gosh, everybody thinks Northern Europeans are all the same. So those kinds of changes, I think, are really important. And one of the things that we see across these three cycles, the restrictionist period, the mid-century restrictionist regime, civil rights, is a kind of two parallel tracks. On one track is essentially the consolidation of white, or the consolidation of an idea about what it means to be white, and the growing, the enlarging, the ever-enlarging circle of who gets included in that. And so by the middle decades of the 20th century, the idea of a white American includes far more people and far more diverse groups of people than anyone would have considered part of the same ethnic group in the 18th century. So a kind of consolidation of ideas about whiteness and the enlargement of that category, at the same time an increasing racialization of undesirable immigrants. And that really does begin with Europeans in the late 19th century. The idea that Southern Europeans, Eastern Europeans might be of a slightly different racial character, that might not have the same qualities that would lead to good citizenship of Northern Europeans. But that idea of a racial logic gets applied more and more to Latin America and Africa and other places where people of color dominate. So we can see in this slide a comparison of a quote from the restrictionist era from a classic text, restrictionist text called The Passing of the Great Race, which was a kind of lament about the decline of Anglo-Saxonism in the United States, and really a call for the kinds of immigration restriction that we see in the 1924 Act. And then Lyndon Johnson delivering a relatively famous speech denouncing the racial logic of the national origins quota system that had been put in place in 1924 in the middle of the period that saw the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. And in that very spirit, Johnson is saying that the country erred in 1924 in applying restrictions, not just to, as he says here, Southern and Eastern Europe, but also to one of the developing countries, a kind of oblique reference to what used to be called the Third World, and now we often call it the Global South, parts of the world that are dominated by people of color. We can see the racial logic of this period applied, as we see here in some ways, to Europe. So this is from 1923, an editorial in the Public Ledger, Philadelphia Daily, that is complaining about cheap labor from the lowest social layers in Europe's most backward districts, the dregs of European society, and so forth. It's not quite the quote that we heard this past week from the president, but it does sort of reflect a similar kind of notion, right, that the places that are sending immigrants to the United States are undesirable places, and the people who come from there are themselves undesirable. But over time, this logic of undesirability and its interlocking with race will be applied more and more to non-European parts of the world. And we can see that some of the beginnings of this in a really interesting book that John Johnson put together called Latin American Caricature, where he looks at how American dailies represented countries in Latin America and people from Latin America, particularly the Caribbean, in the 19-teens and 1920s. People from those places were represented as unruly children who needed the guidance of someone like Uncle Sam, and were inferior in their ability to achieve a kind of Republican citizenship and so forth. This is the kind of logic that gets applied more and more. But there's a counter logic too, and this sort of takes us to the other side of that equation, in which in the 1930s and 1940s, immigration, especially European immigration, becomes a kind of celebrated tale of Americanness, and more people get included in that in that definition. One of the interesting pieces of evidence for that is this song called "Ballad for Americans" from the 1940s, which is a very long 10-minute or so song that's quite popular in the era, and really comes out of a kind of spirit of New Deal liberalism and almost wartime togetherness. But you see at the end of this particular stanza this kind of inclusive notion. I'm just an Irish, Jewish, Italian, French, and English, and so on, kind of listing of places of national origin of Americans, and the idea is we are this kind of country of immigrants. The only sort of non-white group here is the Chinese, which is a quite, I think, interesting inclusion, and there are some other pretty obvious omissions here that you might note. So in some ways, this is representing that kind of widening of the category of whiteness. Okay, I want to jump forward then into this last period of immigration and nativism so that we have some time for questions. After we move past 1965, the Hart-Celler Act, which does away with the national quotas from 1924 and really introduces the modern immigration regime, which we more or less, with some important adjustments, but more or less still have, which is based on family reunification largely. That is to say, if you have a relative in the U.S., you have a stronger position to be able to immigrate to the U.S. and skills. At the same time, the kinds of immigrants are shifting. You can see in the right, it's really Latin America and Asia that are beginning to be the dominant places of origin for immigrants into the United States. This produces a new wave of nativism that really gets launched in the 1990s. There are whispers of it earlier, but it's really in the 1990s that this comes into focus. And in this period, if we go back to, sorry to click back and forth, I don't have even, if we go back here, the nativism of this post-civil rights era does not focus on explicit racial language. Instead, it focuses on things like language, especially English only. It focuses on crime, and it focuses on jobs. And the economic argument is particularly strong in this period. And then, of course, after 9/11, religion and religious radicalism have seen a resurgence in its role in nativism. So much of the movement to restrict immigration and to deny immigrants to the United States certain kinds of rights takes the form of restricting people's access to health care, making public schools English only, and those kinds of things. And California, ironically, given what a progressive state California is today, California in the 1990s was really the center of this anti-immigrant sentiment. And much of it revolved around the perception that immigrants were not just taking American jobs, quote-unquote American jobs, but were also utilizing social services to a degree that was unfair to native-born Americans. So I really do want to leave time for plenty of questions, and so I'm going to stop here and thank both of my colleagues, and turn it over back to Kate to moderate some of the Q&A. Thank you.